Crucial and urgent international climate negotiations in Glasgow have begun as more than 130 world leaders gather for the United Nations COP26 summit. Global leaders will say how their nations will tackle the threat of global warming. It's hoped they'll agree broad outlines and then government officials can sort out the important details. But there are some noticeable no-shows. The Chinese President Xi Jinping, Russian President Vladimir Putin and the Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan decided not to travel to Scotland. It follows news from scientists who say the chances of meeting the goal to keep global temperatures from rising by more than 1.5 degrees Celsius this century are slipping away. The world has already warmed by more than 1.1 degrees and current projections over the next decade will hit 2.7 degrees by the year 2100. If this were to happen, much of the planet's ice would melt, raising sea levels and likely increase the extreme weather conditions.
The doomsday clock is close to striking the witching hour as world leaders gather in Glasgow to discuss climate change. But as they arrive in the city, there's more than its gloomy weather on the agenda, as we've been hearing. Our science correspondent Jeremy Wilkes joins me in the studio now to talk about what we can expect. Well, Jeremy, it's called the Conference of the Parties, but there's very little to celebrate. Tell us, how did we get in this position?
It all goes back to 1992 and the establishing of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is then the body that's around these meetings and that's organising these meetings. And the discussion that we're having here in Glasgow is basically picking up from the Paris Agreement in 2015 and saying, how much have you reduced your greenhouse gas emissions by? And that's something called the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions. The countries have to come forward and declare what it is they've done. The other thing that they are talking about, which was actually initially discussed back in Copenhagen in 2009, is climate finance. So how much are the rich countries giving to the poor countries in order to help them to cut their greenhouse gas emissions and to adapt to this warmer climate. And the other big thing they're talking about, which again is kind of kicked on from Paris because they couldn't agree in Paris, is the rules on a carbon market, how they're going to establish a proper international carbon market. That is going to be discussed in great detail in the next 2 weeks.
And so many terms come out of these conferences, you can understand some people's confusion. You know, one thing a lot of my followers have been asking me is, what exactly is net zero?
What is net zero? I mean, it's one of those things, yeah, you hear from a lot of countries and also from a lot of companies, and there's no universal definition for what net zero actually means. It's one of those nebulous terms. The idea, of course, is that the amount of emissions that you have to put out into the atmosphere because you can't clean up a certain industry are then pulled back either using machines capturing carbon from the atmosphere or by planting trees or restoring mangrove swamps or whatever. Things like those sorts of things. That's the idea. At the moment, lots of countries are saying they want to do net zero, but as I say, there's no real definition of what that means. And something that could come out of Glasgow is a proper conversation, perhaps over a period of months, to define that concept, to make sure there's not too much in the way of creative accounting, as you tend to see in tax operations, for example. The same kind of thing could happen with net zero for sure, so we need to try and avoid that.
And so with all these topics on the table, you know, what will success look like 2 weeks from now?
What does success look like? Well, you know, you've understood already, I think, from the UK government is, you know, trying to talk down what success is going to look like. But the main thing is, can we rebuild trust between the richer countries and the poorer countries? And that is making sure that the $100 billion a year target of financing from the rich to the poor to help them with mitigation and adaptation is actually going to happen. That was supposed to happen by 2020 and it's not happening yet. So if that comes through, that will be considered a success. Work to reduce methane emissions, which is actually relatively easy. We've got the technology to do it. That needs to happen too. We need to create a properly functioning international carbon market. I don't think that'll happen in the next 2 weeks, but advancing on that will make a difference. Killing off coal properly on a national level as well as internationally will also be seen as a success. And then I think the main thing is agreement to meet earlier, rather than every 5 years under the Paris Agreement, to say let's meet every year, every 2 years or every 3 years in order to discuss these reductions that we've made in greenhouse gas emissions, to accelerate this process and to actually achieve the goals that were set out in 2015.
The stakes couldn't be higher. Jeremy Wilkes, our science correspondent, telling us what we can expect over the next 2 weeks. Thank you.